The time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on the diplomatic efforts being made to support Australian Calm Gillespie in light of the death sentence imposed on him over the weekend?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I and the government are very sad and concerned that an Australian citizen, Mr Calm Gillespie, has been sentenced to death in China. The Foreign Minister and Australian officials have raised Mr Gillespie's case with Chinese counterparts on a number of occasions. Australia's opposition to the death penalty is bipartisan, multi-partisan, unanimous, principled, consistent and well known. We advocate consistently for the abolition for the death penalty worldwide via every diplomatic avenue available to us. We will continue to provide Mr Gillespie with consular assistance and engage China on his case. Our thoughts are with him, his family and his loved ones.
The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's JobMaker plan will drive our economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic to create jobs and guarantee the essential services Australians rely on?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you to the member for Bass, keen supporter of the Bridge North Parrots. It's great to be joining them recently on the airwaves with their new radio program. If you're down around Bridge North Way, I can highly commend the program to you. Mr Speaker, Australia has done well, as we have acknowledged, in our response to the COVID crisis, both from a health point of view and from an economic point of view. But that is not to in any way understate the terrible economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis. The economic impacts are real and they're damaging, and for Australians directly impacted, they are heartbreaking, causing great anxiety and great uncertainty. 30 months of jobs growth was lost almost overnight. Budget revenues will be significantly impacted. 2 years it will take, it is anticipated, before we can even return the economy to a scale that it was at prior to COVID hitting us. 5 years at least, Mr Speaker, 5 years before we can regather the ground of growth that we had been looking forward to as we were ending last year. Mr Speaker, this response that the government has put in place is in two levels. There is the short-term support that is necessary, particularly at present, and then there is the longer-term economic changes that are necessary. That's what our JobMaker plan is about. It's about restoring our economy, what was lost from that economy, from the impact of COVID-19. That is a 5-year plan, and it's a plan that must be implemented as it is being implemented, and it must be done in parallel with continuing to exercise disciplined budget management, because that's how you guarantee essential services. Our government remains absolutely committed to those essential services and the funding support we've provided for them in hospitals and schools, and we are very well aware of the increasing pressures in aged care and disability services, and we will meet our commitments. Infrastructure is a critical part of that JobMaker plan, together with the announcements we've already made on skills and industrial relations and energy, federation reforms, and there'll be many more which we will speak to in the months ahead. And today I've announced $1.5 billion in extra funding for ready-to-start projects together with the states and territories. Some $9.3 billion has now been brought forward in the past 8 months to ensure we can get these projects on the ground and running as they are occurring. And we're also bringing forward the fast track of 15 major projects with states and territories worth some $72 billion, including the Marinus Link, which I know the member for Bass would be very interested in. Mr Speaker, some 66,000 jobs all up in these 15 major projects, and we'll be seeking to half the approval times, Mr Speaker.
Time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Reserve Bank Governor has called for infrastructure spending to be fast-tracked to support Australian jobs at least 11 times since the 2019 election. Why has it taken a pandemic for this 7-year-old government to wake up to the need for a bring forward of infrastructure investment?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This government has been running a $100 billion rolling 10-year program for infrastructure development, Mr Speaker, and since last November we have worked with state, territory and local governments to bring forward or inject additional investment, which now totals $9.3 billion. $4.2 billion for joint priority projects with the states and territories that we announced at the end of last year in the mid-year update. $1.3 billion bring forward of financial assistance grants program, which was announced by the Deputy Prime Minister in May. $500 million in new funding to establish a new program supporting all councils to undertake local road and community infrastructure upgrades in May. $1.75 billion in additional funding for the Sydney Metro Western Sydney Airport, and $1.5 billion for shovel-ready projects and targeted road safety works, which I've announced, Mr Speaker. Now, I know the interjection from the Leader of the Opposition about the airport, Mr Speaker. This is the Western Sydney Airport he said he believed in, and he didn't get a dozer on the site in 6 years, Mr Speaker. It took this government, Mr Speaker, to make Western Sydney International, Nancy Bird, Walton Airport a reality. Oh, the Leader of the Opposition blames John Howard, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition is blaming everybody for his problems today. He's blaming everybody for his problems today, Mr Speaker. It's the New South Wales Labor branch's fault. It's the Victorian branch's fault. Apparently it's the New South Wales Liberal Party's fault, Mr Speaker. But I note today we have "Who's going to protect Albo" on the front page of the Age, Mr Speaker. I quote it, Mr Speaker. I am simply quoting the
Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister resume his seat. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I mean, that issue raises many questions. Undoubtedly, the Leader of the Opposition will attempt to answer them with the candour that I hope he at least matches what the Victorian Premier has. But, Mr Speaker, the question is, who does he need to be protected from?
No, the Prime Minister.
Who does the Leader of the
Prime
Opposition
Minister will
need to
resume
be
his seat.
protected from?
Prime Minister will resume his seat.
I've concluded my answer.
Well, I'm still going to point out to the Prime Minister the question didn't ask about alternative policies. The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's Job Maker plan is continuing to fast-track the rollout of infrastructure, both nationally and locally, to support and create jobs as part of the recovery from COVID-19?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And Job Maker, infrastructure. There's a member who gets it. He understands, unlike those opposite Mr Speaker, he understands the importance of creating jobs to build back better, understands the importance of creating jobs to help us through COVID-19, understands the importance of jobs, particularly regional jobs, in the Cowper electorate. He's been fighting hard for them. Long before he even got to this place, he's been fighting hard and absolutely delivering. And on Saturday, Port Macquarie Airport, $3.5 million. Kempsey Airport, $327,000 as part of 60 regional airports that received money under the Regional Airports program. And it's been very clear from COVID-19 that we need a recovery plan, and we have it. We have it, and it's all about jobs. It's all about creating opportunity, and we are doing the investment.
Member for Lawler. Deputy Prime Minister.
Part of our $100 billion pipeline of investment that sustains and supports 85,000 jobs. 85,000 people who need that work to help them have the prospect of a better future. And everything that the member for Cowper does is building towards a better future in his North Coast electorate, Mr Speaker. And around half of the Commonwealth's $100 billion decade-long transport infrastructure pipeline will be spent over the next 4 years. It includes the recent steps to accelerate spending, which totals more than $9.3 billion, as the Prime Minister has just said, in the past 8 months, including $4.2 billion infrastructure boost at MyEFO. I know those don't care about that. I know those didn't listen to that, but certainly we're getting on with putting in the infrastructure that's creating jobs across the economy. And in addition to $16.3 million brought forward through the financial assistance grants, which we did recently, The Cowper councils which will benefit, Bellingen, Coffs Harbour, Kempsey, Nambucca Valley and Port Macquarie Hastings, will all benefit from those fags, will all benefit, including they are included in the 537 councils across Australia which are getting a doubling of their Roads to Recovery funding under a local roads and community infrastructure program. Now, I know how belligerent the member has been about the Pacific Highway. He has fought hard for that. He has made sure that as part of his campaign, as part of his advocacy, that we are building a better, safer Pacific Highway. And that involves a 2.5-hour reduction. It's all well and good to talk about how many millions of dollars we're spending, but it really gets granular, and people really understand it when you talk about a 2.5-hour reduction in travel time from Hexham to the Queensland border. And that is just part of the advantages, the benefits that people will receive from our rollout of infrastructure, from our rollout of today's announcement, where we're cutting through the red tape, we're getting rid of those hurdles towards building better infrastructure, particularly for regional Australia.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why has the Prime Minister left the people of Murray Bateman and Yass behind by failing to announce an investment in the full duplication of the Barton Highway today?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, we're spending $100 million on the Barton Highway. Those opposite had 6 long years, Mr Speaker, and they didn't invest in the Barton Highway. But I tell you what,
Members on my left. Members on my left.
We are making sure, Mr Speaker, that when it comes to the Barton Highway, when it comes to the people of Eden Monaro, that we are investing in their infrastructure. And on Saturday at Merimbula, they were no doubt cheering the fact that they're getting $4.5 million for their airport. And that's going to be important. It's a gateway to tourism for that wonderful South Coast town. Mr Speaker, I was at Tumut Airport, where the Mayor, James Hayes, was very, very pleased to be receiving $152,000 towards the Tumut Airport, which is going to be so valuable, particularly after the bushfires, Mr Speaker, particularly after the bushfire season that we had. That money is going to be invested in strengthening and lengthening the apron and the taxiways of that airport.
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, planes are important, but they can't land on roads. And this question was very clear. It was about the Barton Highway, nothing else.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume
Highway.
his seat. Some planes can land on roads, but your point's right nonetheless. I'll just say... No, that's true. But I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister it was a specific question, and whilst he has compared and contrasted some of the infrastructure projects, he can't do that for the rest of his answer, the Deputy Prime Minister.
The Barton Highway is important. It absolutely is, and I travel it probably more than most, Mr Speaker. When I come over here from Wagga Wagga to attend Parliament, I travel on the Barton Highway, and yes, it does need duplication, no question about it. As part of our $100 billion infrastructure, we have also prioritised the Barton Highway, Mr Speaker, as you'd expect us to. And we are investing heavily. And every time I go on the Barton Highway, Mr Speaker, there are road signs. There are road signs. There is slowing people up to because of the activity, Mr Speaker, that's going forward. There's a lot of work being done on the Barton as I drive through Murray Bateman. This side of Murray Bateman, there's a lot of work done. But, Mr Speaker, the other night I was wandering past the opposition leader's office, Mr Speaker, and I felt this strange
the Deputy Prime Minister, no. The Barton Highway does not run past his office.
Mr Speaker, it is also incumbent upon the opposition leader, Mr Speaker, to explain what dodgy, shoddy deal he's done with the Shooters Party, Mr Speaker.
Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. appreciate the member for Ryan being on his feet. Just the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister, and if we can just pause for a second. Even though no one's jumped except the member for Ryan, just the member for Moreton. You never help. You might be trying, but you never help. I just don't want the call to get out of order, so it is the independence question. The member for Kennedy.
KP,
so I knew I couldn't avoid it.
KP, not independent. Speaker, the morning has been a Turkish delight, I've got to say. Prime Minister, COVID is here to stay, warranting surely a return to 2006 visa entrant levels of 360,000, now 640,000, and from countries with no democracy and or no rule of law and or no egalitarian traditions and or no industrial awards and or no Judeo-Christian love everyone, make a better world. Isn't Visa Shop University's claim of $23 billion in exports actually income from cab drivers and after-hours cafe workers? Surely we should be enriched by annual inflows of diversity, but not, as 60 Minutes highlighted, drowning in a tidal wave of foreign values.
Well, the Prime Minister's got 3 minutes to address that series of questions. Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for Kennedy for raising the important issue of migration in this country. The member for Kennedy is, in fact, a long-term product of that program. We've all come from somewhere else at some point in time in our background, unless we're Indigenous Australians, and the member for Kennedy comes from a very proud line himself. And we are the most successful migration country in the world. There is no doubt about that, Mr Speaker, and we're the most successful multicultural country in the world. Migrants have overwhelmingly added to our nation and do so every single day. And points are raised around the issue of the employment of migrants in Australia. ABS data of working-age migrants released just last week shows that 68% were employed, up from 65% in the last characteristics of recent migrant survey. Now, this compares to 65% for those born in Australia. Recent migrants are also getting more skilled, with 69% arriving with tertiary qualifications, up from 65% in the previous survey. 1 in 3 small businesses in Australia are managed or owned by migrants and employ hundreds of thousands of people right across Australia. The great success of Australia's migration story is that it is a story of people who have come to make a contribution to this country, not to take one. That is the success of our migration policy. And, Mr Speaker, our migration policy will continue to be not just an economic pillar of this country, but it will continue to be one of the most important social pillars of this country. Now, Mr Speaker, no system is perfect, and integrity in migration is important. And that's why I commend the Minister for Home Affairs on the outstanding work that he has done to ensure that Australians can have confidence in our migration program, regardless of what stream that migration comes from. And we will also remain ever vigilant, I will commit to the member for Kennedy, to ensure that we maintain the integrity of that program, both on the integrity of the program—
The Prime Minister resume it. I haven't called you, member for Kennedy. I haven't called you. Everyone watching can't hear you. I haven't called you. I haven't called the member for Kennedy because, with the number of questions he asked, it was actually, and this is somewhat unique, it was impossible for the Prime Minister not to be relevant to the range of subjects that were raised. The Prime Minister has—
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm equally fond of the member for Kennedy. But, Mr Speaker, he raises the important point of temporary migration, and one of the important issues that has occurred in our migration program over the last decade is temporary migration has become, under the skills program, a pathway to permanent migration that ensures that we can have a greater confidence of those who move into the permanent program that they have established the skills, employment and the security in the community to be successful permanent migrants. And there is a connection between the two, and has been a positive connection. So, Mr Speaker, our government will always be supportive of positive migration, and also we will ensure its integrity, whether it's from protecting the integrity of our borders or protecting the integrity of the scheme on which so many Australians depend.
The member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the Morrison government's strong economic management and fiscal discipline is helping to make the Australian economy more resilient during the pandemic crisis, while also continuing to provide the essential services that Australians rely on?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ryan for his question and acknowledge his extensive experience in local government, with the biggest local government of all, Brisbane City Council, before coming to this place. Now, Mr Speaker, we understand that Australians are doing it tough. Doing it tough because we are going through a one-in-a-century pandemic, Mr Speaker, that has seen business and consumer confidence reach record lows, and that saw in the month of April 600,000 fewer people in the workforce than in the month prior, Mr Speaker. But we are on the road back. Australia is on the road to economic recovery, Mr Speaker, and consumer confidence has picked up 90% from its lows. And after the announcement of JobKeeper, we had a record run of 9 consecutive weeks where consumer confidence increased. And business confidence has picked up 70% of its lows, Mr Speaker. We saw a record 25-point jump in business confidence recently, and in the March national accounts we saw a particularly strong result for mining investment, Mr Speaker, up 10.3% through the year. Now, Mr Speaker, we have been singled out by international agencies for our strong economic performance. We talked recently about the OECD, who said that Australia's economic growth will contract by 5% in this calendar year, but will grow by 4% next calendar year. Now, Mr Speaker, that is in comparison to New Zealand, who are going to see their economy contract, according to the OECD, by 8.9%, the United States 7.3%, the United Kingdom 11.5%. And the reason why we've been able to deliver a strong economic performance is because of the $260 billion of economic support that we've provided, like the cash flow boost, like the extended instant asset write-off, and like the JobKeeper program. The JobKeeper program, which is supporting Lisa Stevens in her gym business in Indooroopilly, Mr Speaker, F45, a gym that she said has been able to be kept open because of the JobKeeper program, and supported the 5 staff in Indooroopilly, Mr Speaker, with this gym. And hundreds of thousands of businesses right across the country are also benefiting, millions of workers, as a result of our JobKeeper program. Now, this was only possible because of the strong economic position Australia had as we entered into this crisis, including balancing the budget for the first time in 11 years, Mr Speaker. And that fiscal discipline gave us the financial firepower to respond. Now, Mr Speaker, there's no money tree. The member for Rankin will have you spend more and spend for longer, Mr Speaker, but there's no money tree. Government is there not as a limitless spender, but as an enabler for small business throughout the country.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. The government came to office promising 100 dams, and for 7 years now, the last dams built were Labor projects. What support is the government giving the Brogo Dam and the Eurobodalla water storage supply projects?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we're getting on with the job of building dams, and I've never had once the Shadow Minister for Water come to my office and say, I'd love to see these dam projects put on the list, Mr Speaker. But rest assured, Anthony Lynham from the Queensland Government has. I've had good discussions with him about building dams. Haven't had any from the Shadow Minister, and if she were really serious about building dams, she would have raised it a lot sooner than that. And in New South Wales, Melinda Pavey has had good discussions about building dams. We talked last week in the parliament about Dungowan Dam. We talked about the $480 million that we're putting. I see the member for New England nodding. We're raising the dam wall at Wyangla, Mr Speaker, $650 million project. We are getting on with the job of business cases and actually putting shovels in the ground to build more dams. And we will continue to do that. $3.5 billion we've got. And I know for dams, Mr Speaker, Deb Frecklington in Queensland has a project scheme where she wants to link up dams, where she wants to build dams, and we acknowledge and we certainly are going to invest in that. I know the member for Kennedy, he wants dams built in his electorate. We've had some good discussions. So I invite you to do what the member for Kennedy's done. Come down to my office. Let's have the discussion, whether it's a New South Wales dam, whether it's a Queensland dam, wherever the case might be. And we have put in place the national water grid, established on October 1 last year, and that is going to cut through some of the bureaucratic red tape that has impeded the building of dams. And rest assured, we cannot build dams without the say-so, without the help, without the assistance of the states. That's how our federated model works. I know that might be a bit of a confusing thing for the member who asked the question, but we're getting on with the job of making sure that through the national water grid we have the plan, we have the purpose, and we will build water infrastructure. And you only have to look at what we're doing as far as agriculture is concerned. We want to raise it from a $60 billion enterprise to $100 billion by 2030. The National Farmers Federation, Fiona Simpson and everybody else involved in that august organisation understands that you can't grow and continue to grow even further the best food and fibre in the world through our farmers, world's best environmentalists, without water. And that's why we are investing heavily in helping to drought-proof our nation. Drought-proof our nation. We will continue to do that. We'll continue to do it through better water infrastructure, and I welcome the member to come to my office, sit down and have a cup of tea with me, and let's talk about it.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister please outline to the House what the Morrison government is doing to make environmental assessments more efficient? And how is this helping create jobs and investment to support our economic recovery as we come out of the other side of the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Grey for his question. I, like him, welcome the Prime Minister's announcement today that we will be fast-tracking assessments for 15 priority infrastructure projects. This includes the Marinus Link between Tasmania and Victoria, emergency town water supplies in New South Wales and the Olympic Dam mine extension in South Australia, a $3 billion project that will deliver 1,800 jobs to South Australia in its construction and 600 operating jobs going forward. Now, these 15 projects are worth more than $72 billion in public and private investment and will support more than 66,000 direct and indirect jobs. Having stronger and faster environmental approvals is a key component to our economic recovery, and today's announcement builds on the good work our government has already been doing. Since last year, we've seen assessment timeframes improve from 19% of key decisions made on time to 100% in May this year. We've more than halved the time taken by the Commonwealth at the final stage of these assessments, down from 90 days to 40 days. And we're clearing the backlog of outstanding decisions. And we're going to do even better, halving our overall timeframes for major projects from 3.5 years to 21 months. And we've already delivered quick and robust decisions on major projects ahead of time, without any relaxation of environmental safeguards. Just last week I announced approval for the Chaffey Dam pipeline with the member for New England. This important project will extend Tamworth's town water supply by 6 months if it doesn't rain. And as the Prime Minister announced this morning, we're on track to decide Snowy Hydro 2.0 in well under 2 years, unlocking over 2,000 regional jobs. But it's not just about faster approvals, it's about better approvals with strong protection for the environment. After this year's bushfires, we are taking a careful approach aimed at protecting impacted species and their habitat, taking advice from my expert scientific panel. We're also working with the states, updating our assessment bilateral agreements. We've completed the update with New South Wales, and our update to WA's agreement is well underway. There's more improvement to come with the EPBC review, and we look forward to Graham Samuel handing down his interim report at the end of this month. As the PM said today, ultimately our objective is the streamlining of Commonwealth and state processes to a point of single-touch approvals. National Cabinet will come back to this issue shortly and discuss further measures to streamline Commonwealth and state processes informed by the current EPBC review. The Morrison government is protecting the environment, jobs and Australia's economic future.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that fewer Australians than expected are receiving the wage subsidy, while more Australians than expected have signed up for JobSeeker?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, only the Labor Party would lament the fact that fewer people needed an economic support program than was estimated. Mr Speaker, only the Labor Party would be disappointed that the need was actually less than what was estimated. That tells you a lot about how the Labor Party,
Members on my left,
Speaker,
member for
have
Rankin.
been engaging with this issue on the COVID-19 response. I can tell you, Mr Speaker, I'm very pleased that fewer people have had to draw down on that program. I'm very pleased, Mr Speaker, and I'm also very pleased that JobSeeker has been there for those who need it. Some 1.6 million Australians, Mr Speaker, who have needed that program because JobSeeker has been put in place, Mr Speaker.
Rankin.
He's young and enthusiastic, Mr Speaker, very enthusiastic, but what he might care to do is listen to the advice which says that when there are fewer people who need economic support, that's a good thing. That's a good thing, Mr Speaker, and it is a tribute and it is a commendation to the work that businesses have been doing to bring us through the COVID-19 crisis. They've been holding on to staff wherever they can. They've been supported by JobKeeper wherever they can, and for those who aren't able to be supported by JobKeeper, then JobSeeker has been there for them. That's what JobSeeker has demonstrated. And again, I am not going to demonise JobSeeker. Those opposite seem to think that JobSeeker is a second prize, Mr Speaker. That's not my view. JobSeeker is there to help people who have lost their employment. Now, if the Labor Party want to demonise JobSeeker and say to them that if you're on JobSeeker, you're on second best and you should somehow be stigmatised because you're on JobKeeper, that is what the Labor Party are saying right now. And it is a shameful indictment on them, Mr Speaker, that they would seek to do that to people who are on JobSeeker. We have done both of these programs to help Australians through one of the greatest times of their need. And the good news is that as compared to countries all around the world, the economic response that this government has put in place means that we're doing better than almost any other developed economy around the world today. Now, that is something I know Australians would be pleased about. The only ones who would be disappointed about that result sit on the opposition benches, because all they can see in these things is an opportunity, Mr Speaker, for themselves politically. They say they support these measures, but from day one they have sought to undermine them, Mr Speaker, and for that they should be ashamed of themselves.
The member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's JobMaker plan to cut regulation and to reduce compliance costs will support small and medium-sized businesses and create jobs?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And as a fellow small business owner, I know that he understands and is very supportive and passionate about small business. And it was only just last week that we met and spoke about Australian manufacturing, particularly in his electorate of Longman. Mr Speaker, cutting red tape has always been in the Coalition's DNA because we understand the needs of businesses. Now, as the Prime Minister outlined this morning, cutting red tape and deregulation is crucial to fast-tracking our economic recovery and getting more Australians back into work, and that is exactly what JobMaker is all about. Now, Mr Speaker, during the height of the COVID-19 crisis, we actually saw what could be achieved when regulators rethought their processes. For example, we had some very great successes in cutting through red tape to help ramp up Australian businesses to produce and distribute hand sanitisers. So the TGA, Australia Post, the Tax Office, Safe Work Australia and the National Transport Commission, they all stepped up and they all worked together to support those businesses, both small, medium and some large enterprises, as they work towards setting up a hand sanitiser production and delivery right across Australia. So, as I said at the Press Club previously, the COVID pandemic has shown what is possible if we facilitate rather than over-regulate. Now, Mr Speaker, as the Technology Minister, I'm particularly pleased that digital technology has been identified as an enabler to simplify and to speed up government interaction with businesses and with industry. It's very clear that our laws have not kept pace with digital technology, and particularly that is the case with business communications. We actually need to make sure that we are embracing and adopting those new technologies, particularly blockchain, and we need to streamline how governments at all levels do business to bring us in line with what the community's expectations are of us. Now, since well before this pandemic, the Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister has been working with all members and senators for the government to look at deregulation and how we can make it easier for businesses to do business. Our aim has always been to make sure that tradies and mum and dad businesses wanting to grow and create jobs have the opportunity to do it and to do it easily. Because we know, Mr Speaker, that when industry succeeds, it means more jobs for the Australians who so desperately are looking for work at the moment.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his last answer and his repeated statements that he would not accept job seeker being portrayed as some sort of second prize to JobKeeper. Isn't it the case that JobKeeper recipients maintain the work relationship between worker and their employer, whereas job seeker recipients do not? Isn't it true that a person is better off if they have a job?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Members on my right, member for Deakin.
Mr Speaker, the challenges of JobKeeper as time goes on is that businesses will form views about those employees who they will be able to keep on longer term and those who they will not. And where there are not jobs for people, Mr Speaker, it is important that they become engaged with employment service programs and other forms of income support. The purpose of that is to get them back into new jobs, to have them trained for new jobs. Mr Speaker, that is the challenge going forward. Now, the Leader of the Opposition makes the point about the financial support provided to those on JobKeeper compared to those on JobSeeker. Well, Mr Speaker, the actual level of benefits, when you take into account many others—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, my question didn't go to that at all. It went to the relationship between a worker and the employer that's there with JobKeeper and it's not there with JobSeeker, whether people are better off if they have a job. It's that simple.
The Prime Minister has the call. The Prime Minister has the call. I'm listening closely to his answer.
I was simply making the point that those who are on JobSeeker receive an equivalence in fiscal support because of the other programs, Mr Speaker, that they have the ability to access. Now, Mr Speaker, those who are on JobKeeper do maintain that connection to their employment. That is the case. But, Mr Speaker, what we are now interested in as a government is those who will be able to have that connection in 6 months from now, in 12 months from now and in 2 years from now, Mr Speaker. The reason we put JobKeeper into place all those months ago is because we did not want businesses to make decisions about the future of their employees when the issues were so uncertain. Now, Mr Speaker, this is a fast-moving crisis, and it's important that we remain agile to the changes in what we are seeing before us. JobKeeper has been doing its job. For part-time and full-time employees, it has been providing the exact support that we had designed it for it to have. And for equivalent casuals of 12 months or more, it has been doing the same thing, Mr Speaker. And those who haven't been able to access that program have been supported by JobSeeker. And, Mr Speaker, these programs are in accordance with the Australian way of how we do things, where we don't provide some sort of a gradated level of income support based on what people's salaries used to be. The JobKeeper program was in a class of its own internationally, Mr Speaker, and it has been recognised as such. Those opposite have sought to undermine JobKeeper despite supporting it from the day. They say they support it and then they undermine it every day, Mr Speaker. Each way Leader of the Opposition, everything he supports he also supposes. He's for something, he's against something, all at the same time, Mr Speaker. That's why they don't trust this Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. This is a Leader of the Opposition who went to an economic conference this morning, Mr Speaker, and couldn't even give a speech.
The Leader of the Opposition can't take a second point of order unless it's on something other than relevance. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the resource sector is leading Australia's economic recovery as we come out the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Water, Resources and Northern Australia.
Well, thank you for the call, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for his question? And we know the member for Herbert is a great supporter of the resources sector. In fact, he rolls his sleeves up, gets out there every single day in his electorate, supporting coal, supporting gold, and he knows why, because of the economic contribution the sector makes to this country. The economic contribution it makes to this country. Now, in the face of the most significant public health and economic shock we've had, Mr Speaker, in over 100 years, it is the resources sector that is delivering. It is delivering for our economy. In fact, the resources sector in the past year has continued to punch above its weight. It's contributed around 9% to Australia's GDP and 25% of all growth in our economy. Now, I'll say that again. 25% of all growth in our economy is coming from the resources sector. Now, that equates to some $294 billion worth of exports. In fact, we continue to expect the iron ore sector to go through $100 billion worth of exports in just 1 year. The first Australian commodity to ever do that, the first Australian commodity. Now, in the March quarter, mining output was $1.6 billion higher than the same time last year. Mining investment reached $13 billion, and around 1/4 of all private business investment. Now, that is a very strong performance, Mr Speaker. Now, the Morrison-McCormick government has an economic plan to turbocharge jobs in Australia and to turbocharge jobs in regional Australia, and the resources sector will be an enormous part of that work. Now, over 1 million Australians work directly or indirectly in the resources sector. Now, we want to see more Australians work in that sector. I want to see more youth in particular get an opportunity as an apprentice or a trainee, as an engineer, to find their way in the resources sector to get a good job and pay their own way. Now, Mr Speaker, we know that projects like Valeria Coal, like Olive Downs, like New Hope, like Adani will contribute around 3,000 jobs to Queensland alone. 3,000 jobs from those resource projects. Now, in this country, Mr Speaker, we know we have to grow it, mine it and make it. That's got to be our plan moving forward. This is how we'll drive jobs. Now, we know those opposite, Mr Speaker, a couple of them are concerned about the economy. We've got a couple that are supportive of the resources sector and the some $300 billion they might contribute.
I'll just say to the minister he can't canvass members of the opposition because the question didn't ask for alternative policies.
Of course, Mr Speaker. But we do know there are a number of people who do support the sector. We know a number of people will get together and support the resources sector. We know there are some of them who are very keen on the jobs the sector provides, up to 1 million direct and indirect across this country. We know that there are some who have been named. They've had to go underground, Mr Speaker, for their support. They've had to go underground, according to reports on the weekend. But once again, Mr Speaker, it is this side of the House that will continue to support jobs in this country. We will continue to be the job-making government, quite simply because we have done it before, and we will do it again, and the people of Australia can trust us in what we say.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer when he said the challenges of JobKeeper as time goes on is that businesses will form views about those employees who they will be able to keep on longer term and those who they will not. Prime Minister, how many Australians do you expect to lose their job when JobKeeper is cut off in September?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, well, as the Leader of the Opposition well knows, the government will make further decisions regarding ongoing fiscal supports in late July, after considering the economic circumstances at the time, Mr Speaker, and after having received the advice from Treasury. But the Leader of the Opposition plays a dangerous game, Mr Speaker, when seeking to raise expectations about Australians in this economy. Mr Speaker, it is true that JobKeeper has provided, together with JobSeeker, the cash flow assistance and support and the many other assistances that the government has provided at unprecedented and record levels, that has provided the economic lifeline that Australians have needed. But, Mr Speaker, we cannot say to Australians that governments or anyone else ultimately will be in a position to ensure that every job can be saved and every business can be saved. That is unrealistic. And if the Leader of the Opposition wants to play politics with that, Mr Speaker, he would be being negligent in his responsibilities and callous in his words to the Australian people. We know we're in the middle of one of the worst recessions we've seen, Mr Speaker, certainly the worst one we've seen since the Great Depression. And we know that in recessions there are terrible impacts that are had on livelihoods, Mr Speaker, and on businesses and on people's jobs. And we will seek to do all we can, as we have, with the unprecedented support. But I'm not going to make false promises to the Australian people, Mr Speaker. We have cushioned the blow, but we can't prevent the blow. And we will be doing everything we can to ensure that those who do lose employment gain employment again through the JobMaker program and the many reforms and changes we'll be introducing to see our economy grow again and see the businesses open again and see the jobs come back again, Mr Speaker, because that's where the jobs will come from. This Leader of the Opposition thinks he can go around and guarantee everybody's job with someone else's money. You can't do that, Mr Speaker. He thinks government should be at the centre of the economy.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, on relevance, it went to the Prime Minister's expectation, based upon his own quote, of how many would be expected to lose their jobs when JobKeeper is withdrawn in September. Surely the government has some modelling, some expectation. That was the question that was asked.
I have to say to the Prime Minister, the question was narrowly confined and it didn't go to the opposition's approach, but I'll call the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, well, I made reference to the work that Treasury is doing currently. I made reference to the statement that will be delivered by the Treasurer in late July, when there will be further updates to what Treasury believes to be the economic situation on employment and many other of the key economic parameters. That's how budget processes work. We are in June. July will tell a different story, and indeed September will tell a different story. It has been our approach to take this step by step and cautiously, get the best expert advice, listen to the best health advice, listen to the best economic advice, and make the judgments that Australia needs this government to make. And that is how, and that is why, our government has ensured that Australia, working together with the states and territories, is in the top tier of countries that have been able to respond to this crisis on both health and economic.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government has maintained and improved the capacity of our health system throughout the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how has this work supported our hospitals and improved access to important medicines?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins, not just for her question but for her work more generally within the health system, but particularly along with the member for North Sydney, the member for Macarthur and others, on the allergies inquiry, which will make a big difference to the capacity of the health system going forwards. In what has been the most intense of periods, our health system has performed extraordinarily well. It has been, I think, by all assessments, the envy of the world with the way it's dealt with the coronavirus challenge, the way that the primary care system has stood up and our doctors and our nurses, supported by telehealth, have dealt with coronavirus, the way that that system through our aged care network has stood up, and I'm advised today that there are now no cases in any aged care facilities remaining active in Australia. Equally, the tribute rests with our hospitals, where our hospital workers, our doctors, our nurses, our carers, our cleaners, our administrators have done an extraordinary job. We've expanded that capacity to 7,500 ventilators. At the moment, the latest advice I have is that there are 2 Australians with COVID-19 on ventilation. So what an outstanding job. But throughout the course of this, we've also had to plan and prepare for the long term to expand that capacity still further. We've been able to strike a new National Hospital Reform Agreement with the support of the Prime Minister, with the support of the Treasurer, to invest $131 billion in an agreement with every state and territory. We're going from what was a $100 billion agreement to $131 billion. But much more importantly than that, investing specifically in new high-cost therapies such as CAR-T therapy, life-saving treatment for people with blood cancers who might never have that opportunity but for an agreement such as this. At the same time, building the Hospital in the Home program to give people more flexibility to be with their loved ones during the course of treatment. This is an extraordinary national achievement done in conjunction with the states and territories, and at the same time delivering a new 7th Community Pharmacy Agreement. And this CPA expands by $1.5 billion the amount of funding which has been delivered to our pharmacies for better medicines, a $1.2 million program for assisting with better medicines for our elderly, for Indigenous Australians, for those with chronic conditions, an expansion as part of that of $100 million, but perhaps most pleasingly, 800 new pharmacies in rural and regional Australia to support rural Australians, to support Indigenous Australians with better access to medicines. It's about saving lives and protecting lives and supporting the system.
Concluded. The member for Fowler.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today is International Cleaners Day. Prime Minister, why has the government deliberately excluded cleaning staff at aged care facilities for the retention payment which was given to other aged care workers during the coronavirus?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member. However, there is a very important point which he seems to be missing. We've invested over $850 million right across the aged care system to expand that capacity and to support that capacity. He refers to one sub-program within that, a $230 million program, which was designed specifically to protect and to support those who were dealing face-to-face and providing additional care at a time when around the world we were seeing those—
Members on my left.
At a time when around the world we were seeing those carers facing both a specific risk and that we were at risk of losing their support in terms of staying on the job. So we were able to provide that retention bonus of up to $800 for each of the 2 current quarters, the June quarter and the September quarter. So all workers across the aged care system are supported by the $850 million package. The specific program was always intended from day one to support our nurses and our aged carers. So that was what it was set out to do, and it is doing that. What it means is that we are supporting Australian workers. And what was the result of that? I just mentioned in the previous answer that we have now cleared coronavirus from every aged care facility in Australia. And when you look around the world and you see what's occurred in sophisticated health systems, whether it's in Italy or France or Spain or the United Kingdom or Canada or the United States, and we see the tragedy and the agony in those systems and the success of Australia's system, what it says is that we have been able to successfully build that system. And we've done it by investing in the needs of our aged care workers. We've delivered support to them, and we've also been able, through the additional funding of $850 million right across the aged care system, to help underpin the viability at a difficult time for aged care facilities, of those facilities, which makes certain the wages of those aged care workers, no matter what particular role they have, as well as providing the supplement to those whose health was directly at risk and to those whose likelihood from around the world was that they were most at risk of leaving the work or facing the health risks. So that's what we've done. The net result is we've been able to maintain the safety of our aged care residents. That's the first task. We've been able to support them. We've been able to keep going, and all of these things have meant our workers have been safe, our residents have been safe, and the system has been viable, and that is one of Australia's great achievements during the course of the pandemic.
The minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Attorney please update the House on how the Morrison government is working to make the process for parties entering into enterprise agreements simpler, and how this will enhance prospects of jobs growth, economic growth and wage growth?
The Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And the member is very well aware that enterprise bargaining has been a central part of the industrial relations system in Australia for 25 years, and when it works well, it can definitely be to the mutual benefit of employees in the form of higher-than-award wages. It works well for employers in terms of more productive, more efficient businesses. And of course, the overall economy and everyone who wants a job can benefit as the economy gets stronger and there's more job growth. So we are focusing on this area as one of our working groups as part of our JobMaker program in the rebuilding of the Australian economy task that's before us. And when you have a look at the mutual benefit that can give rise from enterprise agreements, 38% of working Australians at the moment are covered by collective agreements, including enterprise agreements, and 21% are covered by awards. The average weekly earnings under the awards, part-time and full-time, is $788.80, and under agreements that figure is $1,331.20. So the agreements lead to higher wages. And this, of course, was Paul Keating's vision. In 1993, he described his vision for the system. He said, for most employees and most businesses, wages and conditions of work would be determined by agreements worked out by the employer, the employees and their union. These agreements would predominantly be based on improving the productive performance of enterprises, because both employers and employees are coming to understand that only productivity improvements can guarantee sustainable real wage increases. And he went on to say that it was a model under which compulsorily arbitrated awards and arbitrated wage increases would be there only as a safety net, and over time the safety net would inevitably become simpler. There'd be fewer awards with fewer clauses. The difficulty, of course, has been that the number of enterprise agreements has sadly declined. It reached a peak in December 2010. 2.6 million employees were covered. That figure is now about 2.2 million. And why has that happened? Well, the Fair Work Commission in a 2019 report cited things like increasingly technical requirements arising from Commission decisions themselves, delayed processing, inadequate education, explanation and guidance, and substandard communications process. So in one example, which is the Wesley Mission in Queensland, there was an enterprise agreement exercise commenced in 2016. It resulted in a positive vote in September 2018. Then it was approved a year later, but then many years later, in March 2020, it was overturned due to a technical error. So those sort of failures stand as a disincentive for others to get into that system. So the third working group that we've commissioned is going to focus squarely on enterprise agreements, because they've been proven to be a means that we can leverage to regrow our economy after the COVID-19 pandemic, and in a way that can put upward pressure on wage growth. Because when we look at agreements approved in the December quarter of 2019, they delivered an annualised wage increase of 2.7%, which was higher than the economy-wide wage increases and higher than inflation. So if we fix this system with cooperation and consultation, we can help grow the economy.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister reverse his decision to deny Teddy Sheehan a Victoria Cross? Surely the Prime Minister regrets denying this honour to a man who strapped himself to the gun of a sinking ship to shoot down enemy aircraft and save his mates.
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the bravery and service and contribution of Teddy Sheehan is not under question. He was an incredible and brave Australian. Mr Speaker, like 40,000 others who lost their lives during the Second World War, and each and every day of those 6 years, acts of bravery, acts of selflessness, acts of sacrifice took place. Mr Speaker, at that time, there were a small number of Victoria Crosses that were handed out over the course of that campaign. And there are a very small number of those who are mentioned honourably in dispatches, particularly from the Navy, and Teddy Sheehan was one of those. Mr Speaker, when you look back into history, 80 years ago, you've got to be very careful about putting yourself in the position of those who stood before you and made these decisions. And all I am seeking to do is assure myself in the responsibilities that I have that, Mr Speaker, I can be assured that the policy test that was adopted by the previous government and held by our government, that there needs to be, Mr Speaker, there needs to be compelling new evidence that would justify the revisiting of that award. The Valour inquiry found there wasn't. There has been a subsequent tribunal which was not reviewing the decision of the Valour inquiry but was initiated by a separate process, and both of those inquiries have come to different conclusions. So I am simply seeking to honour the system. I have advice from the CDF on this matter, Mr Speaker, and the interjections come from those opposite. I sought the advice from the CDF, Mr Speaker, and I have accepted his advice, but I have also asked for this very specific issue to be addressed. I'm simply seeking to preserve the integrity of the honours and awards system. And, Mr Speaker, when I received that advice from the eminent Australians of Dr Nelson, of Dr Shergold and Brad Monera, Mr Speaker, and David Bennett, the former Solicitor General, who are eminently qualified to look at this specific issue. And I want to thank the member for Bass, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Brad. And I want to thank Guy Barnett, a former member of the other place, for the constructive engagement I've had with them, and the Premier of Tasmania, who have been engaging with me on this issue for some time. And, Mr Speaker, I've respected their meetings with me, and I've appreciated them, and we are working through this issue. We just have to make a decision that is consistent with government policy and respects the honours and award system. But I want to make this very clear. Teddy Sheehan was a great and brave Australian. There is no dispute about that.
The member for Braddon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is investing in the energy infrastructure we need to create jobs as we recover from COVID-19?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Braddon for his question. And he knows, as we all do on this side of the House, that a strong Australia coming out of COVID-19 means having access to affordable, reliable energy. And as a farmer and small business owner, he also knows how important it is to streamline processes and get rid of red tape in order to encourage investment and jobs growth, Mr Speaker. Now, that means that we can get on with investing in the energy infrastructure that is absolutely crucial for the future of this nation. And I note that the member for Braddon is a keen supporter of the Marinus Link project in Tasmania. He knows that jobs like that that projects like that can encourage local jobs and investment in his electorate. Now, Marinus Link will provide a second interconnect alongside Basslink between Tasmania and Victoria, Mr Speaker, and in the process it will bring down energy prices and it will assure the reliability and security of our grid in southern Australia. But, Mr Speaker, it will do much more. It will do much more, because in his region of northwestern Tasmania, it will create a jobs boom, Mr Speaker. 3,800 jobs at peak, from Marinus, up to $7 billion of investment, Mr Speaker. We are getting on with the job of Marinus, just like we're getting on with the job of many infrastructure projects right across Australia. And it's great to see, Mr Speaker, along these lines that the New South Wales Government has given its approval to the Snowy 2.0 project in the Snowy region, Mr Speaker. Now, not only will Snowy, like Marinus, drive down prices and keep the lights on, it's creating a jobs boom in the Snowy region, Mr Speaker, up to 2,000 jobs at peak already. We see 500 jobs being created from the Snowy project, up to 850 by the end of the year, Mr Speaker, and indeed 100 small businesses around the region are already benefiting from the Snowy project, and that's many small and family-owned businesses like the Owers business, Philip and Yvette Owers, who run the National Crane business in the area, and they're benefiting from the Snowy project. James McMahon, the third generation to provide services to the Snowy business, Mr Speaker. On this side of the House, we are getting on with the job with ensuring that we streamline the processes, get rid of the red tape, so we see the energy infrastructure we need in this country, in the Snowy region, in northwestern Tasmania, because that will assure a strong Australia as we come out of COVID-19.
The member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The member for New England has called for a royal commission into the dairy sector because, he says, and I quote, "Those with market power have utilised it at the expense of our dairy producers," close quote. But the Agriculture Minister has rejected the call by the member for New England. Prime Minister, who is right?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, I'm glad to see the member for Hunter actually had the time to put a question in today. He's obviously got his 20 guests for Otis this week. But let me say to him, I have not ruled anything out. No one has ever ruled a Royal Commission out on any matter. It would be unwise to do such. But to create a Royal Commission, you need to have the evidence that there has been malpractice. You do not simply call for a Royal Commission at the drop of the hat, but if those that have evidence to suggest that there has been wrongdoing, be the supermarket, processor, then there would be evidence that would be put forward for a determination to be made. That's a simple process that we undertake. That's what you do. You undertake it on fact, not on fiction or politics. That's what the member for Hunter is trying to do here. And it is only on this side that we've become concerned about the dairy industry and trying to undertake real reform, because the ACCC report in 2018 clearly identified there was a market imbalance, and their recommendation to us was to introduce a dairy code of conduct. That is what we did. That is what we are doing, along with complementary measures to make sure that there is equity in that market. But to come in here and to make rash statements is unwise, it's unhealthy and it's reckless.
The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister outline to the House the Morrison government's commitment to strong and efficient borders is working to protect Australian families and manage the flow of critically important goods?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. And the member for Bonner is a very, very strong supporter of the Port of Brisbane, and he is a great advocate for industry in his local electorate. And he must be, Mr Speaker, because we want to create jobs. We want to make sure that we can facilitate trade, that we can grow businesses so that they can help us in the post-COVID environment. Mr Speaker, we were one of the first movers on travel restrictions in relation to closing of our borders, not just with China but with other countries, obviously, and those travel bans were scaled up and they resulted in contributing to the success that we've had in dealing with this pandemic. Mr Speaker, we've also had, though, a dramatic impact on the way in which we can reduce the burden on businesses who seek to trade, both importers and exporters, those that want to bring goods into our country and those farmers and other manufacturers that seek to export goods. We've established the Trusted Trader program so that we can try and reduce the regulatory burden and make sure that we can help those people increase their bottom line so that they can employ more Australians, so that we can help grow their businesses, get government off their backs so that they can help unemployed Australians get into a job. Mr Speaker, the other aspect, of course, importantly at our borders in recent times has not only been to try and work with supermarkets, and we established a task force to work with the CEOs of the supermarkets in our country to reduce the burden, again to try and help them bring in produce and products into our country in a more expeditious fashion. But we've also been able to provide support to importers and exporters by making sure that we've stamped out those people that seek to undermine that business model by sending, in particular, PPE equipment overseas and some who tried to import some of that equipment as well. In fact, Mr Speaker, the ABF, as at the 12th of June, has stopped some 779,000 items on export, including over 720,000 face masks, but also hand sanitizer, alcoholic wipes and other disinfectant products. And the ABF's also seized on an import of 46,000 items being predominantly counterfeit COVID-19 test kits and fake or unapproved medicines. So it is important to get the balance right, Mr Speaker, to make sure that we keep our borders secure, to make sure that we reduce the costs for our importers and exporters so that they can help grow employment in our own country. And to get that balance right, we need a very effective Australian Border Force, and led by Michael Outram, the Commissioner there, he and his staff right across the country, whether it's at our seaports or airports, have done an exceptional job. And I really praise them for the work that they've done in helping to keep Australians safe. They work day and night in that cause, and they should be praised for their efforts.
Still in question time? Yep. The Leader of the Opposition. Yep.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister reverse his decision to slash postal deliveries to Australians?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll ask the Minister for Communications to add the answer as he sees fit. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is seeking to portray an issue once again which does not accord with the facts of the situation. Mr Speaker, Australia Post is responding and managing their business to meet the needs of customers during the COVID-19 crisis. That is what they're doing, and so as they have to adjust how they deliver services, they are no different to any other business around the country who are having to do just that. And what the head of Australia Post has said is they are keeping all the jobs. They're protecting all the jobs. But like in so many businesses across the country today, Mr Speaker, some employees are being asked to do different tasks as they deal with the different types of demand that business, that organisation is faced with. I've never understood, Mr Speaker, why the Leader of the Opposition seems to think there's one rule for some and a different rule for others. This is an organisation working to meet the needs of Australians during the COVID-19 crisis. That's what they're doing, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition seeks to make cheap political points on a daily basis in this place about the COVID-19 crisis. That's disappointing, Mr Speaker. What the Australia Post is doing is delivering on their service charter. They're delivering to customers. They're keeping people in work. They're adjusting their business model to deal with the increase in parcels as opposed to letters, Mr Speaker. They're doing their job. I wish the Leader of the Opposition would do his, Mr Speaker, because those about him are certainly noticing that he's not up to the job of that job, let alone any others.
The member for Clark.
Lines.
Oh, sorry. No, the member for Clark will resume his seat. No, the call has to alternate. I'm sorry. Yeah. I call the member.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is giving regions stricken by drought and bushfires the support they need to recover, rebuild and prepare for their future?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Lyon for his question and also his leadership, not only during the fire event of the summer of this year, but also during the drought. And there's been a triple whammy in his electorate of COVID-19, and many electorates around the country have had that triple whammy. And it's important to acknowledge that the programs the government's put out in direct payments, but also infrastructure under COVID-19, goes to those communities as well. But we've been very mindful of understanding that our response to fires and drought is not just about money in their pockets straight away, it's about building the infrastructure around those communities to build them back better. And that's been an important principle that we as a government made sure that the investment we've undertaken does that and achieves that. And with the Bushfire Recovery Fund, the $2 billion fund, we will have $1 billion of that spent by the 30th of June. We only anticipated $500 million of that would be out by the 30th of June, but hence has been the speed of which we have been able to get that money out of the government's pocket into those that need it. And it's been through infrastructure programs where we've given it to councils to be able to put into infrastructure. But it's also $240 million separate to that has gone into immediate support, and we'll continue to make sure that those programs are targeted. And in fact, so much so that we announced a further $450 million where local economies will decide exactly how that money should be spent to build back better. We're empowering them to empower their future through their decisions. And then with the drought, proud to say that in the last couple of weeks we announced under a drought round of Building Better Regions Fund $207 million that will go to local economies to be able to build infrastructure that diversifies their economic base and not just preserves the jobs that are there, but creates new jobs. Create new jobs in those local towns to make them more resilient for drought. And that's on top of the more than $335 million we put out through the Drought Communities program, $1 million to some councils, all of them in which, some of which have got $3.5 million to build infrastructure projects to keep the economy going, small-scale infrastructure projects. $100 million recently announced for upgrades of regional airports, keeping the connectivity between regional Australia and metropolitan Australia going and investing in the infrastructure to do that. And the dams, $3.5 billion, and I'm proud to say the Deputy Prime Minister will be in my electorate at Emu Swamp Dam before the end of the year, because finally the Queensland Government has chipped in a measly $6 million of the $47 million required, and we're going to have an excavator moving before the end of the year. A fantastic outcome. Fantastic, and in fact, farmers put in more than the Queensland Labor government. They'd be bought kicking and screaming. But nonetheless, and now the Future Fund, the Drought Future Fund, goes live with its first investment on the 1st of July. An investment in the future to put the infrastructure around regional and rural Australia to build them back better. Because we know if we equip them with the tools of the future to face up to these disasters, if you invest in regional Australia, Australia's better for it.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.